This is the final segment of Dr. Mark Schenker's The Rise of the Modern in England and America, a look back at 1922. And tonight we will hear about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Welcome, Dr. Schenker.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And thank you everyone for attending, whether you've been here before or not. I'm going to assume you haven't, so I'll just say a few things about modernism. Modernism in England and America was an artistic movement. I'm talking fundamentally about literature that flourished between the two world wars. So in the 20s and 30s especially. It has several characteristics. One is that modernism was a reaction of artists and intellectuals to the idea that technology and what was called progress was actually ignoring the essence of human nature and character. And so one aspect of the modern is a turning back to the primitive, to the pre-technological, to not progress, but looking back historically. And so you get many writers and painters. Picasso embraced African art in this period. T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland explores pre-Christian pagan myths and the Bhagavad Gita and Sanskrit. Joyce writes Ulysses based on Homer's Odyssey. The Rites of Spring by Stravinsky looks at pagan myths as well. And the idea is that there was something more genuine, more authentic in the primitive power of the pre-technological, of the pre-contemporary. That's one aspect that's pretty uniform throughout modernism in literature. Another is an interest in embracing the art of collage, of recognizing that the idea of an integrated life is no longer possible in a chaotic modern world of the 20s and 30s with all its technology and communications. It actually didn't bring things closer together. It reminded us of how apart we are from each other. And so the feeling of alienation in people's own experience and the feeling of the world being too complicated to make sense of leads to this embracing by people like Picasso, one of the co-inventors of collage, to the idea of taking something whole, ripping it apart, and putting it back together in some new combination that might not make sense in terms of integration, but makes sense in terms of an experience of divided wholeness, if you will. Donald Barthelme, the poet and short story writer, his dates are 1931 to 1989, said famously that the principle of collage is the central principle of all art in the 20th century in all media. If you know the great 1937 painting by Picasso called Guernica, that captures the chaos and pain of the Spanish Civil War in a remarkable large painting that is essentially collage. Barthelme said that the only forms I trust are fragments. And so one of the things you have to embrace in experiencing The Wasteland is the idea that it is a poem built on fragments, and that I'll make a point about that as we turn to the poem. But I'll say a few more things about modernism. It's also very much influenced by the First World War, by the trauma of the First World War, by the sense of people, especially in England, who experienced the war longer and more intimately and more closely than we did in America, that the war destroyed the sense of 19th century heroism, of these treaties between empires that turned out to be kind of swindles, and the idea that in the 19th century you could die for your country in the Crimea, falling on a saber. Instead, you could be blown to bit or have your feet rotted off in the trenches of France, led to a really kind of cultural trauma and the introduction of a dark irony about how things in life don't quite fit In fact, part of collage is recognizing that the apparent wholeness of culture is a sham, and the way to improve it is to rip it apart and put it together again. So in this poem, there are multiple tones and voices and registers and little dramas, and you don't know who's talking, and there's lots of importation of quotes from all kinds of reading. And so I'll stop here to say that I want to give you this evening, in the hour that I have, not just the sense of the poem as a cultural document, which it is. It is one of the most important poems in English in the 20th century. I think that's indisputable. But also to remember that it's a poem and to try to capture what it does as a reading experience. Nobody in this room is going to go home a few months from now and say, you know what, I think I'll curl up with a copy of The Wasteland and read that before I turn in. It's not that kind of poem. But there is great power and beauty in the poem that you can have access to if you're willing to let yourself be confused and unfulfilled. There are whole books online and elsewhere that can gloss for you, interpret for you, every reference, every language, every hidden meaning in the poem. If you were a graduate student, I might tell you that's worth your effort, but probably not. I don't recommend that for you. I'm not going to be glossing those tonight. I have two languages, English and a little bit of French, and they won't stand me in good stead. But I want to give you a sense of what the poem is doing by loading it up with all those fragments of cultural references, which T.S. Eliot knew, and knew most of us, or most of the people in 1922, would not recognize. And that's mainly his point, that people are out of touch with their own culture. Of course, he was a polyglot, a polymath. He was incredibly learned. He had to know that his experience with culture was not the standard by which to judge other people. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of it as a poem. And what is a poem? A poem is the expression, this is my definition, the expression or the enactment of an experience that's conveyed by language and form. So novels can give you an experience, but novels usually are so long and complicated, they're mainly concerned with a story that may convey experiences at different points. But the concentration in a poem, the concentration even in a longer poem, the concentration of saying a lot with a little, the nuance or connotation of words, is to try to convey an experience. The experience can be religious or political or anthropological or sexual or patriotic, on and on and on. But if the poem's any good, it's not a statement or a moral, it's not a thesis, it's an experience. And so it's possible to ask yourself about The Wasteland, as with any other poem, what am I experiencing when I read this poem? And we're going to break in a little bit, certainly before the half hour. And I'm going to ask Lucy if any of you have given questions in the chat about your experience in reading the poem. What was it like to read or reread this poem? A question you can't possibly get wrong. I'm just looking for your feedback to have a little bit of interplay so I don't spend the whole hour talking at you. But most people find that there's a great disorientation in reading the poem. You feel overwhelmed by a kind of chaos. Sometimes you respond to the little snippets or vignettes. They have a kind of charm or beauty. And then there's a cacophony again that comes up a little bit later. That's quite intentional. Alienation as an experience of human beings in their contemporary world is a creation of the 20th century. Nobody in John Milton's time or Shakespeare's time or Chaucer's time felt alienated. They might have felt depressed. If they moved to a place they hadn't lived before, they might have felt out of place. But to be alienated, that is to feel strange in your own environment, that's a 20th century psychological existential phenomenon. And it goes to just what I'm talking about the sense of the integration of the modern world not being effective. So if we turn to the poem and we ignore the fact that it starts with a quotation in Greek and that it hails Ezra Pound as the better maker. Ezra Pound advised another poet, a friend of his, advised T.S. Eliot to get rid of about, 60% of the poem. He cut it down enormously and improved it in those people who've seen the original. So the first section of 5 is called The Burial of the Dead. And what I want to convey to you is that that's a rite from the Book of Common Prayer. Any Anglican reading this poem contemporary with T.S. Eliot would recognize the phrase, the burial of the dead, as coming from the Book of Common Prayer. Not the content here, but the title. And they also would recognize in what I'm about to read to you, that as dark as the phrase burial of the dead might seem, it's not talking about the dead, it's talking about the burial of the dead in the context of a ritual, a Christian ritual. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots in spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So that section ends with a full stop period, a second full stop period. You see the 4th line ends in a period, so does the 7th line. And then the tone of the poem, the length of the line changes. Someone's talking and the person later on is identified as Marie. But before we get to that, what can we say about those first 6 lines that's very general? April is the cruelest month has become a famous line. You notice that the poem is constructed so that the line doesn't break where it's logical after the comma of month and land and desire. It leaves the verb, the gerund, breeding, mixing, stirring, covering, feeding. It leaves it at the end of the line, even though what follows is connected. It's breeding lilacs, it's mixing memory, it's stirring roots, it's covering earth. That is, the poet, by leaving the adjective in a verb form hanging at the end of one line and separating it from what it belongs to, has done some of what I've already talked about, taken something whole, feeding a little life, stirring dull roots, and breaking it apart. William Carlos Williams does the same thing in a famous poem called The Red Wheelbarrow. He takes wheelbarrow, which is one word, and breaks it apart. What's the point of this? The point is it gives special emphasis to the last word in the line, breeding, mixing, stirring, covering, feeding. And you notice that breeding and feeding rhyme. What's being emphasized here? That in spite of the dead, April resurrects us every year. The spring gives a promise of new life. This poem begins with that general image in the context of a Christian sacrament, the burial of the dead. Not just a dead body lying in a gutter or lying in a ditch or lying in the mud of France, but a ritual that promises a resurrection. Breeding and feeding are good things. And so for people who feel that the poem is overly negative, it begins and ends in a promise of regeneration. The problem is, for Eliot, that too many people are deaf to that promise of regeneration. They have lost their faith in spirituality. They have lost their respect for the procreative act of sex. They have lost their respect for themselves. So it's very much a kind of work of a prophet who is promising or pointing to better things if only we would get out of our stupor and see it. So the poem promises something positive. Why is April so cruel? Because when the year dies in the winter every year, and we are awakened to new life, some of us get up and some of us don't. This is especially poignant when you think of the long 2 winters, the 2 years of COVID, that all of us know of people, some of us are themselves those people who have lost loved ones. And it mixes memory and desire because the promise of new life breeds desire in us for spring. How many people have been happy about the forsythia and the cherry blossoms and the colors coming out and the warm weather, and felt checked by the cold weather today or other days in April, that we have a desire for new life, and that's what April brings us. But it also mixes in memory of what we've lost, of the people who lay down with us figuratively in a winter hibernation and have not risen again. I just want to say to you, if you can capture that sense, you see that part of the poetry of the poem is the nice touch of breeding, mixing, stirring, covering, feeding a little life with dry tubers. There's promise. It's a muted promise, but it's a promise all the same. And then the register changes, and it's this little snippet of someone named Marie. It turns out this is someone that Eliot himself met. I'm not going to use our time to explain every reference, but an aristocratic woman who, as a girl, did what she says here. Summer surprised us coming over the Starnberger with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the hop garden and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russen, stam auch Schlichtdown, echt Deutsch. And when we were children staying at the Archduke's, my cousin, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. If you know nothing about what that refers to, if you didn't know when you read the poem, the little bit I told you about who this person Marie is, it doesn't matter. It's a snippet of life of someone who clearly is privileged, right? Staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, how many of us can say that? Reading much of the night, going south in the winter. This is a life of privilege. And this life, like the other lives that we're going to hear snippets of, are all involved in the same life and death issue, where whether we like it or not, we lie down every winter and only some of us get up every spring. And then the third register is introduced after the break in the text. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Stony rubbish is an image we will see constantly. It is what the wasteland is. Fragments, rubbish, and stony, suggesting no growth. No growth. You notice the wasteland is 2 words, wasteland. And for Eliot, it is the landscape of the modern world. It is partly imbued with images of the First World War and the no man's land and the experience for the first time of warfare as a kind of inferno, a kind of hellish landscape. But it also captures something of the Middle Ages, something of the Bible. He then goes on to say, Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. Again, that notion of fragments, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. And we're going to see in the poem that the hope for water, for nourishment, for the slaking of thirst, for cleansing, one of the great sacramentals in many, many religions and culture is water. Another is fire. We'll have both the fire sermon and we'll have water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of death. Again, whatever that means, it's radically different from the first two registers. A general statement about life, a little snippet of a privileged young girl in Europe who is well born, and then a kind of prophetic, dark admonition about fear in a handful of dust. Evelyn Waugh used Handful of Dust as the title of one of his books. We learn, if we study the poem, that some of these lines were spoken by Tiresias, the Greek figure in myth, who was both a man and a woman during his lifetime, and was both blessed with prophetic sight and blind. And so he's an amalgam of male and female and vision and blindness. He's part of this poem as well. There's another snippet about the hyacinth girl. And it says on the top of, in the next stanza, I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. And that idea of nothingness as almost a positive thing. What is a wasteland but the presence of nothing? What is a desert in the general conception? We know that deserts are filled with life, and a biologist or zoologist would contradict us if we said desert is a wasteland. But in the popular conception and in the way the image is used in literature and culture and movies, what is in a desert? A desert is a whole lot of nothing, an expanse of nothingness. And the poem is going to play on that notion of the wasteland. There's a reference to Madame Sostris, a famous clairvoyant. You see lots of references here to death. Those were pearls that were his eyes, the drowned sailor, the hanged man, the notion of intrigue. You have to be careful when I read horoscopes. For Eliot, this fortune-telling woman would be what we have in place of a shared religious belief. And then I'm going to read the last stanza of this section before inviting comments from you. This unreal city is the end of burial of the dead. And you have to recognize as I read that the death of so many is the World War I death of soldiers. Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet. Flowed up the hill and down King William Street to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. Jesus is said to have died in the 9th hour. There I saw one I knew and stopped him, crying, Stetson, you were with me in the ships at Mile. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. That's channeling Baudelaire. You hypocrite reader, my double, my brother. So again, I could tell you more. I'm not holding back because I'm patronizing you. This is exactly how I teach this poem to college students. The unreal city is London. The image is taken from the 3rd canto of the Inferno, hell, of the dead walking with their feet, with their eyes fixed on their feet. But here it's an image of the war dead, and the idea that the speaker sees someone that he was with at the ships at Mile. That is the Punic War in the 1st century, Rome and Carthage. But all wars are the same. And this notion that has something bloomed, or will something in life disrupt the process of blooming and let the thing not come to life? That's the end of burial of the dead. That corpse that you planted last year in your garden is as far removed from the Christian ritual of the burial of the dead. There's nothing sacramental, there's nothing optimistic, There's nothing hopeful about it. The trajectory of this section, through many changes and many voices, goes from the promise of new life with April and feeding and mixing and covering, the promise of something better than death in the reference to burial of the dead, and ends with this very dark vision from the inferno and of a corpse being buried and they rise again. So I'm going to ask if we can stop at the bottom of the hour, and I really would ask you to hold off on questions or comments about me. And if anyone's willing to share with Lucy a general comment about how you found the poem and trying to engage it, especially if you're a first-time reader or if you've never studied the poem. I really prefer not to hear from people who have an advantage over most of you by having studied the poem in an academic environment. Anyone want to talk about your experience as a reader in engaging with The Wasteland recently or whenever you first came across it?
Well, so far, no one has written anything. Oh, there's one. Hold on a second. Very confusing, but still engaging.
Yeah, so I want to say, can you identify that person by name, Lucy?
Meg.
Meg. Oh, God bless you, Meg. Is that Meg Galliani?
I don't know. Let me
I
see.
think it's likely. Okay, so let me say, whatever Meg that is, bless you, Meg. I do think one of the ways to think about this poem is to acknowledge how confusing it is, and also to recognize that it has a kind of hold on you, that everyone in this room has heard a piece of music or seen a play that seems wacky, or heard a story that doesn't make complete sense, or more typically has heard a poem or a song that captures you, even though if someone said, could you paraphrase that song? Could you tell me what that phrase means? You might say, I have no idea. A good example of that kind of poet is Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas writes wonderfully beautiful, hypnotic, engaging poems. But if you step back, it's not always easy to say what it means. And you're allowed in literature, as you're not allowed in logic or science, to say, I like it and I don't know why. I cannot tell you what it means, but it has captured me, has engaged me. And for many readers, there's something heady about Eliot's ability to channel these different registers and moods. So when he moves in section 2 to a game of chess, he's using a scene from a play by Thomas Middleton, 17th century writer, not popular and well known among most readers in Eliot's time, but Eliot, like some of his cohort, turned his back on the 19th century romantics that most of us grew up with. Most of us who didn't even know poetry much would know who Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats and Byron. What he did is he went back to the 17th century, a century that is not really beloved by most 20th or 21st century American readers. And he captures the sense here of a game of chess that's played in the play and is associated with deception and rape and betrayal and art and artifice. That is a very dark image of a game of chess. A game of chess is a formality, right? A game that has rules that is very far removed from the formality of burial of the dead. And what's explored in this section, which I don't have time to read in its fullness, is the corruption of sexual relations. What has happened to the productive sexual interaction, whether productive in the sense of making babies, but also productive in the sense of making people feel good. And so the first section, the chair she sat in like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble. Well, that first line comes from Antony and Cleopatra. So this Shakespearean evocation of one of the world's great seductresses. And then it moves down through lurking and troubled, confused and drowned, a sad light, an antique mantle, jug to dirty ears, withered stumps of time, like the stony rubbish, like the fragments, another image of the wasteland. And then at the bottom of that long stanza, under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points, clawed into words, then would be savagely still. Savage, of course, is the opposite of ritual, the opposite of discipline. No one would describe a sacrament in any religion as savage. No one would describe a game of chess as savage. No one would describe the hopeful relation between men and women or people as savage. And the idea that her hair would spread out into fiery points gives her a kind of mythological or supernatural imagery. And what follows, like a Medusa, and what follows is a hypersensitive woman complaining to the person she's talking to, presumably a lover. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking? What thinking? What? I never know what you were thinking. Think. And then a different voice, not quoted. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. Now that's clearly an evocation of the fields of France and the First World War. The person who is imagining responding, he's not speaking, which is her frustration, is someone who has experienced that desolation. Maybe a veteran, if we want to get literal, but maybe just someone who has a different experience of life than the richness that was cataloged in the opening of a game of chess. And then the hypersensitive woman says again, what is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing. Again, nothing. That evocation again of nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. A line from The Tempest about a dead body under the water where the eyes have been replaced by pearls. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head but, oh, that Shakespearean rag? It's so elegant, so intelligent. That's his answer. The person who doesn't have a quotation mark is the male who's trivializing Shakespeare when she just said, do you remember those are pearls that were his eyes? He has said, I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. And he's talking now about how Shakespearean rag, he's catching the music of the 20s, debases the great language of Shakespeare. And she says in her hyperkinetic kind of hysteria, I don't mean to say that she's not a stereotypical woman. I'm not saying that he's politically correct, Eliot. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down so. What shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? That is the complaint of the idle rich. What is there to do? The hot water at 10, and if it rains, the closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. Well, the knock is their time is up if they're in a rented room, their time is up because everybody dies, or their time is up if it's closing time in the bar. And that's the segue to the next section, which gives us a snippet of lower class life beside this higher class couple. You can tell from the description of the room. I'm going to read this too, and I want to show you that knocking on the door, which is only referred to, becomes the knock that's repeated in the capital letters in this pub scene a different view of a different socioeconomic class in contemporary London. And a woman's talking. When Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to myself, hurry up, please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back from the war. Make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you've done with that money he gave you to get yourself some seats. He did, I was there. You have them all out, Lyd, and get a nice set. He said, I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said. And think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. And if you don't give it him, there's other will, I said. Oh, is there, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique, and her only 31. Antique is the same word on the previous page about the antique carvings in the upper class room. Both meanings of antique, very different in context. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. That is, to abort any chance of pregnancy. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children. Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday, Albert was home. They had a hot gammon, and they asked me into dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night, ta-ta. Good night. Good night. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. And that last reference is what Ophelia says in Act 4, Scene 5 of Hamlet. Now, if you don't know that, and why would you? The poem doesn't rise and fall on your recognizing that, although more is always more. What you can say at this point is we've seen side by side dramatizations of conversations at the higher end of society, at the lower end of society, both centered on the relations of men and women, and both suggesting that things could be better, to put it mildly. And where do we turn in the third section, but to the fire sermon? And now we return to the notion of religion and spirituality, but not in the Christian tradition, but in the Buddhist tradition. The fire sermon is a sermon that's associated with the Buddha. And I'm not going to read this except to say the unreal city shows up again in this section. There's a long section about an encounter between a carbuncular man and a woman, and groping his way up the stairs, and the idea of a casual and meaningless encounter, sexual encounter. A long passage in italics about the river sweating, and Elizabeth and Leicester, that is channeling the Elizabethan age, another sexual encounter. And the section ends with the word burning in italics. So the fire sermon, like the burial of the dead, does not enact what its title says. There is no ritualistic burial of the dead in Burial of the Dead. There is the travesty of burying a corpse. There is no fire sermon of Buddha in the fire sermon. There's degraded sex. And so what is left for the poem to do but try to point a way to some solution in the 4th and 5th sections, which are radically different, and the first one especially shorter. So in the interest of covering the whole poem, howsoever quickly, I'm going to keep going and read all of section 4, Death by Water. Phlebus the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell and the profit and loss. A current under sea picked his bones and whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebus, who was once handsome and tall as you. So a completely different register, completely removed from the modern world. Whoever Phlebus was, he's a Phoenician. When's the last time you met a Phoenician? This is clearly from some ancient time. You know, one of the reasons why so much of Western culture came out of the Mediterranean, the Greeks and Romans, the civilizations of Northern Africa, is because there were trade routes there. The Greek nation is built of islands. People from all cultures and backgrounds would stop there. They had warm weather for much of the time. There's a good reason why the Greeks invented the Olympics, and the Scandinavians invented existentialism and angst. If you are in Copenhagen, you're not going to come up with wrestling in the nude in a public square, but you might if you're in Athens. And so this turned back to ancient society of Gentile and Jew in the context of early civilization or early Christianity. And notice the alliteration in Phlebus, Phoenician, fortnight, forgot, prophet, the F in prophet, dead and deep as mere rhymes, whispers, whirlpool, wheel, windward. I read this poem first as a high school student. I had a mixed youth, and I have never forgotten that one of the things that happens to Phlebus is that he forgets the profit and loss. That in the world that he's in, math doesn't matter anymore, commerce doesn't matter anymore. As you turn your wheel and look to move forward in your journey, remember that this dead man was once as handsome and tall as you. So what solution is there for mortality, which ultimately is the hurry up, please, it's time. Images of the wasteland in the opening of What the Thunder Said, stony places and gardens, agony suggests Gethsemane. There are lots of references to biblical language. The third who always walks beside you is a reference to a chapter in Luke about meeting Christ on the road to Emmaus. A horrific image with the stanza that begins, a woman drew her long black hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on those strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings and crawled down, head downward toward a blackened wall, and upside down in air were towers, etc. I can't think of a poem that I know well that has a more horrific image than bats with baby faces. And these voices sing out of empty cisterns and exhausted wells. That is, other images of emptiness, of wasteland. The word waste is associated etymologically with the word vast, vast in the sense of empty, broad expanse of emptiness. Well, it turns out that there's a damp gust bringing rain at the end of the next section. And if you look at the last two stanzas of the poem that begin, Ganges was sunken, the river Ganges, and the limp leaves waited for rain while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himmerbank. The jungle crouched, humped in silence, then spoke the thunder. Da! So in the myth of the Upanishads, the thunder says only one thing, da, da, da. But it's human nature to make meaning out of nothing. What do you hear? Nothing. Lucy and I were talking before we started about Passage to India, where the Malabar caves say, boom, boom, and different people read different meanings. The creator's reply in the Upanishads through the thunder is da, a single word. Your children say it, da, 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 like ba, 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 because it's an elementally easy thing to say. But human beings don't want nothing, they want something. So they interpret the da as data, which is give, the word D-A-T-T-A. What have we given? And then the next one, da, is interpreted as dajavam, which means compassion. And here I'll read the section on compassion. I have heard the key turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison thinking of the key. Each confirms a prison only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus, a hero from Shakespeare, a warrior hero, again, revive for a moment a broken, as if the fragments of a statue had been reintegrated. But here the notion is, in the modern world, the best you can do for compassion is not be in someone else's place, but think that each of us in our own prison is confirming a prison and aware of the key that keeps everybody else in their prison. Da, damyata, which means self-control. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm. Your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. Can we get the ship of state righted? Remember the nautical imagery in Phlebus the Phoenician. Can we find a way to sail through the course of life? And it's going to end with an invocation of the Fisher King. And here again, I'll say that if you didn't know this, you could still get a lot of enjoyment out of the poem. But again, obviously, more is more. And so one of the oldest pre-Christian myths is the myth of the Fisher King, that a land was laid waste, was devastated, something that all societies, not just ancient societies, have experienced. We've been devastated by a plague, but in America, we've had devastation by fire and flood. Many places less fortunate than America have devastations on a regular basis. And in the myth, there is a king who is a fisher, someone who can provide his people with sustenance, but he winds up getting wounded. It's different ways in different versions of the myth. He might be gored by a boar, he might be impaled by an enemy, but the fisher, who is a healer to his people, a provider to his people from the natural world of water, gets wounded. You could look up this myth. Wikipedia probably does a good job. There are many books written on it. T.S. Eliot was fascinated by his readings in anthropology and felt that there was some universal truth in a myth that preceded Christ but seemed to anticipate him. And it turns out that the wounded healer, that is, the man who's supposed to help his society, when he gets wounded, the result is that the land becomes more devastated. That when your king is wounded, the land is wounded. When Sleeping Beauty, the princess, falls asleep, the land falls asleep too. And something is needed to revitalize the king. And if the Fisher King can be healed, the land will be healed as well. Eliot's whole point is that there has been a longing in human nature, in human culture, in human lore, to believe that healing is possible. And so he now channels in these closing lines the myth of the Fisher King. I sat upon the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Then Italian fragments. Oh, swallow, swallow, then a French fragment. These fragments I have shored against my rooms. Why then I'll fit you. Hieronymo's come again, another fragment from Renaissance play. Datta, Dadyavam, Damyanta, Shanti, 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 which is a word that means something like shalom, a kind of peace that is existential and transcendent, not just peace of mind or the absence of war. I used all but about 8 minutes, and I want to say that I hope that I've been successful in trying to convey what a big deal this poem was as a cultural document, this extraordinarily erudite man who partly believed that people would be impressed by how much of their own culture they didn't know. But in fact, the average reader is not reading this and thinking, oh, you know what, I should brush up on my Thomas Kyd and my Baudelaire and my Dante. No, they're saying this is an extraordinary performance, partly of ventriloquism, channeling these different voices, a prophetic, supernatural, biblical tone, an everyday tone, both lower class and upper class. Tiresias, Phlebus, the Fisher King. It's an extraordinary performance that is the performance of collage. And one of the things the First World War ushered in is a great appreciation of modern irony. Irony is when how things are and how they seem to clash, and you resolve the irony, if you can, by figuring it out why it only seems to be this way. So if I say to Lucy, thank you for sending me a birthday card last week. My birthday wasn't last week. Lucy has a birthday coming up. Mine's not until June. If I thank my friend for sending me a birthday card, and she knows she didn't send me a birthday card, you have irony. I'm saying one thing that she knows can't be true, a kind of minor irony and sarcasm. And the way it gets resolved is Lucy says, oh, he's criticizing me for not sending him a card. He's being sarcastic, that son of a gun. And that's a simple example of how our irony gets resolved. Well, he presents us with loads of irony, people longing for meaning, for health, for cleansing, for something, and yet constantly doing things that run counter to that. There's no heroic, normative example of contemporary life in this poem. This is a work of a poet-prophet who is tremendously suffused with the culture of Western civilization, sounding an alarm, but also ending with the hope that if we can give, if we can be compassionate, if we can get a sense of self-control, we may find the peace that passes understanding, in the words of the New Testament. I'll stop now.
Don't stop. Does anyone have anything to say in the Q&A?
You may not think of it as a great good time, but if you can get a couple or 3 or 4 like-minded people sometime to sit maybe over some glasses of wine and have different people read slowly. I muff some of the reading because I try to go fast, mindful of the time. But if you can have friends or family read out loud every passage of the poem, where the shifts in register are marked also by a different person reading, you will see how hypnotic and engaging it is, and how when you do that as a drama, some of the meaning becomes clear, even though you might not be able to paraphrase it. The point is, T.S. Eliot did not believe the solution to the problems of the early 20th century was the culture of Dante or Thomas Kyd or Shakespeare. He knew that those were fragments to the people in the 20th century. He believed something more elemental, something more primitive, something that predates that? When's the last time you talked about Buddha? Well, maybe Buddha has a good agent. When's the last time you talked about the Upanishads? When's the last time you talked about the Fisher King? And it's the poet's belief that there has always been something in the primitive strands of culture that promises some kind of healing, and that what the 20th century needs to do is find some connection to that. Now, he himself was a quite devout Anglican, but he knew that you weren't going to write a poem for the ages by suggesting people convert to Catholicism or Anglican Christianity. He was smarter than that.
Okay, well, let's see. You've got a couple of thank yous from Leslie and Eileen. Anonymous says, thank you so much. I was always curious to know a poem such as this. It will mean even more to me when I read it again.
I appreciate that. By the way, Anonymous, I've read all your poems. I think they're great. You're one of my favorite poets. I really appreciate that comment. I'm not making fun of the comment. In fact, if everyone who's here tonight would think of this as a trial run to give you a leg up the next time you encounter the poem, most poems need more than one reading. This is not just a poem, but a kind of collation of poems. It's really a kind of cultural experience. But you have my permission not to over-worry what all the references mean. And again, when I was a graduate student in English getting my PhD, I had the guidebooks, and I would go back and forth from reading the poem to looking up what it meant. But you do that as an everyday reader, it's like reading the poem through Venetian blinds. You read a snippet, you look at the text that tells you what it means, and back and forth. Read it in its totality. If you can get a couple of people to be a chorus of voices, it really does make a difference. And sometime when you're in the mood, read it again.
Okay, another comment from AJ. Thank you. It's actually quite a daunting poem, and I appreciate your reading and explanation because it's so interesting.
Thank you. And remember, this is 100 years old. This poem was published 100 years ago, I think, December. And so this poem is old. This poem is very old, and yet it still has the spirit of modernism and resisting easy explanation. The modernist interest in collage, in tearing apart and putting together. I'll give you a perfect example. This will help. You may or may not know, if you've never seen what I'm about to describe, look it up online to see the picture. Picasso put together the triangular seat of a bicycle. You've all can imagine that. You can remember it stuck up your butt, that triangular seat. And he soldered onto it the handlebars of the same bicycle. So you have the triangular seat with the handlebars on top, and it looked like a steer's head. It looked like the skeleton of a steer's head. Remarkable. And when you look at that, I'll call it collage, you see two things at once. You see the bicycle that used to exist, and you see the steer's head that does. If you've never seen what I'm describing, if you just put that Picasso steer's head, you'll find it. And I remember saying this once in Trinity College to undergraduates, and a student, yes, a male student, yes, an athlete, said, well, I could have done that. You know, what's the big deal? I said, yeah, but you didn't do that. Picasso saw the bicycle, and in looking at the bicycle, he saw the potential for the steer, because he was willing in his head, in his imagination, to rip it apart, to put it back together. And when you see that in a museum or online or in a book, you see the bicycle and you see the steer's head. That is, you see something relatively modern, 19th century bicycle, mechanical, and you see something that is not only ancient and natural, but dead. but it's not a vibrant steer's head, it's a skeleton. And all of us have seen Westerns or cartoons. Bugs Bunny is dying of thirst. And what is there over in the corner? There's that steer's head with the sockets empty and the horns. It's an amazing imagination that can take things apart and put them back together. And Eliot is suggesting that the cure is to reconstitute something about life from many sources and to affirm the nothingness of the thunder, da, 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 with that ancient notion of giving, having self-control, and being compassionate. So give to others. What's it like to be somebody else, and try to have some mastery over your own life. And here ends the sermon. So since this is the end of the series, I want to thank again very sincerely Lucy, who called me many months ago or emailed me to say, would I be willing to do 3 lectures on something? And she was very generous when I suggested that since we'd be doing this in 2022, I might do a look back at the rise of modernism. And she stunned me when I said we could do 3 poets. We could do Hardy, and we could do Housman first, and we could do T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And because Lucy is a great gal, she did not say, what are you, crazy? We're going to have people come to the library 3 times for poetry. Instead, she said, sold, and she let me do it. And this is National Poetry Month in April. I've been blessed by having 8 different poetry events in these 2 months, March and April alone. And I am genuinely grateful that Lucy took a chance on me. We've collaborated at the Newtown Library and let me do Housman and Hardy and Eliot. And I thank you all for coming, for your attention, and for your comments. I hope you all stay well. I hope April is not cruel for you. May is even better, I'm told, and that you enjoy the good weather when it comes. Thank you all and stay safe. Thank you, Lucy.
Mark. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Good night,
Thank
all.
you for coming. Good night.